Famines only occur if political decision makers allow them to. That's the latest word from Tufts food security professor Daniel Maxwell and 9 other leading academics on the situation in Somalia. Professor, after the 2011 famine, resiliency programs and early detection programs were ramped up in Somalia, why is it back in this situation?
Well, first of all, it's important to note that Somalia is not yet in famine. Famine is kind of the most severe stage or the most severe level of a food crisis. And at the moment, we haven't reached that level. We fear that it could reach that level for several factors. The most obvious one is drought. There was a more or less complete failure of the short range last autumn, and that followed on relatively poor rains in much of the country earlier in the year. So the drought has several effects. One is obviously access to food. Another critical one is access to water, and in many cases, having unsafe water to drink in these kinds of circumstances is almost more dangerous than the lack of food, because it's actually diseases, particularly waterborne diseases and measles, that kill especially young children in famine. And thirdly, the conflict between al-Shabaab and the government is still not resolved. And eventually it will have to be. But in the meantime, the conflict is maybe not a causal factor, but certainly a major contributing and complicating factor.
Okay, so tell us how influential political figures can be now on stopping what is imminent famine.
Well, I think you have to look at both people inside Somalia itself and then the external world. I mean, inside Somalia in 2011 during the famine, al-Shabaab restricted the access of outside agencies to access famine-affected people. More critically, they affected the ability of famine-affected people to access help themselves, whether that was through movement out or in other ways trying to access assistance. They also taxed a lot of people and so forth. So internally, something has to change with al-Shabaab. Secondly, different groups are affected differently by these things. And the 2011 crisis and this crisis both affected some of the most vulnerable groups in the country, those living in the south, in the riverine areas, in the inter-riverine areas.
Professor, for those of us in our comfortable homes, what is the urgency that we need to be aware of? Is there anything we should be doing?
Well, I think we're speaking to a Canadian audience here primarily, and I think Canada has traditionally been quite a leader in responding to food security crises of various kinds, and we hope that will continue to be the case this year, both formally, nationally through Global Affairs Canada, and also through more people-to-people kinds of organizations, like, for example, the Canadian Food Grains Bank. But beyond that, we eventually have to, address this issue of conflict, and we hope that Canada has a role to play diplomatically as well as in humanitarian terms.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
That was Tufts University food security professor Daniel Maxwell and acting director of the Feinstein International Center.